Committee on Finance will come to order. Today we have a couple of items, a few items we're going to be taking up. This is our first briefing of the 2020 through 2023 year. And I'd like to welcome everybody first of all. And what you'll find is that I don't like to waste time, so we'll get right to it. So first up is our state economist, Research Economic Analysis Division of DBED, Dr. Tian. Or is it going to be you first?
The other Dr. Tian.
Oh, okay, the other Dr. Okay, Dr. Tian, I'm sorry.
No worries.
Okay, your hero. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Chair Yamashita and Vice Chair Kitagawa. It's always a pleasure to do these. Well, we'll see what the questions look like. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. And I don't think I've ever done this before. So the topic, you have the slides. You also have our forecast report that we released in December. And the title of this presentation comes from that forecast report, which is all about the global war on inflation and what that's doing to Hawaii's economy. And in a nutshell, our forecast is that the U.S. economy goes into recession this year. Doesn't really matter what you call it. It's going to be a market slowing. Hawaii's economy, we think, will avoid a recession, and I'll try and explain some of the reasons why. But the key, I think a key thing to remember is that these are just forecasts, right? Anybody who thinks they know what's actually going to happen is pulling your leg. There's a lot of uncertainty here, and the difference between a modest recession and a much deeper recession in the national economy can have large implications for Hawaii. And so take it with several handfuls of Hawaiian salt. So the big question on everybody's mind right now is what's going to happen to inflation. This is U.S. inflation. It peaked at 9% in July of 2022, and the current reading, I believe it's 6.7% from November. That's a year-over-year growth rate. So the numbers are coming down. That's a very, very positive thing. And the question is, how fast do they come down, or do they stay elevated? And those are sort of the two big scenarios. If inflation stays elevated, then the green line that you can barely see on these TVs is the federal funds rate. So that's the interest rate that the Federal Reserve controls. And the Fed has raised that interest rate faster than any tightening cycle in the last 40 years. And that's really the key, how it impacts businesses, consumers, as to whether or not the U.S. economy enters a recession. So right now that interest rate, the top range of that target is at 4.5%. The Fed will meet again in February, and it's expected that they'll raise the rate to 5%. Actually, if you look at this next slide, that shows you the reason that line looks kind of like stairs is because this is a interest rate that the Federal Reserve controls. So those are the targets for those interest rates. So you can see we were at 0 for many months during the pandemic, and we've gone from 0 to 4.5% in less than a year. And the bond market, the blue dotted line here, another one you can barely see on the TV. We got to get bigger TVs. Super Bowl's coming. So that blue dash line is what the bond market thinks is going to happen. And when we say what the bond market thinks, what we mean is the people who are putting their money where their mouths are and buying and selling bonds. If you look at what those purchases suggest for the Fed funds rate, they're basically predicting a peak of 5.2% in the spring. So we have a meeting in February, we have another one in March, and then April. By April, they think we'll be at 5.25. By March, they think we'll be at 5.25. And then they think interest rates are going to start coming down. So you see the downward movement here in the Fed funds rate. They still think the Fed funds rate will be higher at the end of next year than it is right now. But they think it's going to be coming down relatively quickly or very soon. So how does that happen? It's sort of one of two things. Inflation comes down very quickly, and the Fed says, look, we won. Okay, we blew it, but now we're ahead of the game, and everything's good. Inflation is coming down quickly towards our target. We can start lowering interest rates. Another alternative, these are not mutually exclusive, they could both happen at the same time, is that the U.S. economy goes into recession quickly. And that's what brings inflation down. So the U.S. economy goes into recession, you have more layoffs than everybody thought was going to happen, you have fewer people being hired, unemployment rate goes up, consumer spending goes down, wage inflation goes down, and the Fed says, we won, we conquered inflation, and interest rates start to fall quickly. So some of that shows up in this complicated chart that we'll have the pop quiz on at the end. And Representative Ward, I'll call on you to answer the question.
You're the one we rely upon for all of our budget and everything, so the ball is in your court, sir.
Okay, I'll hit it. These are yield spreads. These are differences between 10-year bond rates and 3-month Treasury bill rates, or 10-year bond rates and 2-year interest rates. And so at the end of the sample, we're way down here. So in other words, right now you can earn higher interest on a 3-month Treasury bill than you would earn by buying a 10-year Treasury bond. So why is that the case? And this is actually the lowest that these yield spreads have been, going all the way back to the late 80s. And each of these gray, on all these slides, the gray shaded area, those are recessions. So notice what happens when you have a recession. This is the late 80s, so that's the 90-91 recession, here's the 2001 recession, here's the Great Recession or the Great Financial Crisis. So every time before you have a recession, these yield spreads turn negative. So the short-term interest rates are higher than long-term, because the bond market thinks the interest rates are gonna fall. The reason they think they're gonna fall is they think we're about to have a recession. So these models using this data are coming up with probabilities of well over 75% for a recession for sometime in the next 12 months. And so our base case scenario is a U.S. recession. This is the historical growth rates for U.S. real GDP. So growth rates in the 3 to 4% range, followed by less than 2% in the fourth quarter of this year, entering a recession in the second quarter of the year. And we'll get this wrong. These numbers will be off. The recession, if and when it comes, will happen. Maybe it'll happen in the second quarter. Oops. Sorry about that. Let's see if we can get this. All right. Our forecast for the whole year is, for all of 2023, is 0.1% decline in the U.S. economy. So a pretty modest recession, but put that in context, in 2001, in the 2001 recession, the U.S. economy grew by 1% for the whole year. It had a sharp decline in one quarter, but for the whole year it grew. We're expecting really no growth for all of 2023. And that will show up, and the way will it impact us most directly is through those interest rate channels, through people consuming fewer houses, buying fewer cars, and when they open up their credit card bills in January and see what kind of damage they did over the holidays, and they recognize that those interest rates are rising. Right? Credit card interest rates are rising, new car loan interest rates are rising, obviously mortgage rates have risen, and all of those lead to a pullback in consumption. That includes a pullback in consumption by local residents in Hawaii and by visitors who may or may not come to Hawaii. So let's say the U.S. economy does go into recession. What does that mean for Hawaii? Well, it doesn't always mean that Hawaii goes into recession. So each of these charts, each of these different squares, which are, maybe you can see it on your screen because you have the presentation, show us the behavior of jobs. U.S. is blue, and month zero is the month before a recession starts. And so you can see back in the 90-91 recession, job growth in the U.S., you go from zero, you fall about 4%, and then it takes almost 2.5 years before you get back to the same level of jobs you had before the recession started. But look at the green line for Hawaii. It never turned negative. So So in the 90-91 recession, the U.S. economy lost, I think it was 3.5% of its labor force or its jobs, and Hawaii continued to add jobs in the beginning of the 90s. The rest of the 90s is a whole nother story, as many of you may remember. And you can see that Hawaii's job growth was completely flat for the second half of the 90s. In the 2001 recession, Hawaii had a sharp decline when all the planes stopped flying, right, when we had the initial impacts of 9/11. The U.S. economy went into a prolonged slump that we didn't get back to normal almost 4 years later for jobs. Hawaii grew very rapidly after the initial shock from 9/11, and that was really the beginning of the housing boom on the neighbor islands, where we were building homes for people from the mainland who were taking advantage of incredibly low interest rates. Again, it was a very loose money period, and that was actually the beginning of the subprime lending process that led to the great financial crisis. So in both the 90-91 recession and in the 2001 recession, Hawaii behaved very differently than the national recession. In the great financial crisis, we were basically average. We looked just like the U.S. average. Some states were hit much harder. The neighbor island counties were hit much harder than Oahu, but statewide was about typical. And of course, we really don't need to talk about the pandemic recession. We know we fared much more poorly on economic measures and much better on health measures during that recession. So the point is that just because the U.S. economy goes into recession doesn't mean that Hawaii follows. And right now we're out of sync. And that's sort of our story about why we think the Hawaii economy won't necessarily enter recession, is that, one, we haven't fully recovered yet. We're still in that recovery process. These charts are indexed, so you take the raw data and you set it equal to 100 in a particular month. In this case, it's the month before the pandemic, February of 2020, and these are payroll jobs and also household employment. You set it equal to 100, and then you can trace the essentially relative to that February date, where are you? So if you look at the U.S. number, it's above 100. So the U.S. economy has exceeded its pre-pandemic level of jobs. So they've completely recovered to where they would have been if the pandemic, it's not exactly true. If the pandemic hadn't happened at all, they would have continued to grow. So employment would be much higher. But we have gotten back to that pre-pandemic level of employment. In contrast, if you look at the gold line here, that's statewide non-farm payroll employment. And we're 5.5% below where we were before the pandemic started. So that's the sense in which we have not recovered. In contrast, the green line is a household measure of employment. There's two different ways we measure employment. One is the Bureau of Labor Statistics calls up all the businesses, or actually they don't call them, but they get information from businesses about how many filled jobs they have. And then they also do what we call a household survey. They call people and they ask them, are you working? And if you say yes, then you're counted as employed. And that's in this green number. If you say no, but you're looking, then you're in the labor force, but you're unemployed. So there's two different measures. They're not exactly the same. The point is that the household survey has almost completely recovered. It's less than 3%. I think it's 2.5% below, 2.7% below where it was in February of 2020. The payroll jobs are 5.5% below where they were in 2020, in February of 2020. And much of that difference, so instantly our labor force is less than 2% below where it was in 2020, 1.5% below. So the labor market has almost recovered. It's just we don't have all of the jobs back. And one of the reasons I think that that's the case is that people haven't taken their second jobs back. So when you look at the payroll survey, it counts every filled job. So if I work 15 hours at Zippy's and 20 hours at Long's, then I have 2 jobs, but I only get counted in the household survey one time. I can only be employed once, but I can fill 2 different jobs. And in Hawaii, we tend to have a higher number of multiple job holders. Unfortunately, we don't have current data for this. The last time we had hard data from the BLS on this was many years ago. But if you do a back of the envelope calculation based on what's happened nationally and assume that the same kind of thing has happened in Hawaii, you can explain 10 or 15,000 of those missing jobs, right? The fact that we aren't back to February 2020. So we're talking about 37,000 shortfall in jobs. And I have sort of there's multiple explanations for this. Some of this is people have just decided they don't need that second job back. The other one is they've got long COVID. And so data that will come out, actually I can't talk about this because it's coming out tomorrow, but data from our last, so we have a endowed professor, HMSA endowed professor in health economics for UHERO, Ruben Juarez, and he's been releasing public health reports. The last one that he released showed us that people with long COVID have a tendency to be unemployed, and the percentage of households in Hawaii that are reporting moderate to severe symptoms of long COVID, and what we know about the national reduction in work effort when you have long COVID tells us that we can explain most of the shortfall in jobs by people experiencing long COVID. There's enough people who have gotten COVID, in fact, gotten COVID multiple times, and a large enough share of them are experiencing moderate to severe long COVID. You can explain most of that 37,000 job shortfall with those metrics, which means we still have a way to improve. We're out of sync with the national economy in terms of overall employment recovery, and that's true across a wide range of sectors. Same kind of graph, but now it's sectors. And the dark blue line here is accommodations and food service. So you can see actually the tourism-centric jobs have actually recovered more than retail trade, which is also somewhat tourism-centric or relatively tourism-centric. Finance, insurance, and real estate is still quite depressed. The only sectors that have surpassed their pre-pandemic levels were actually federal government. Never really saw the kind of decline that the other sectors did. Construction has surpassed pre-pandemic levels, and healthcare is relatively close to surpassing pre-pandemic levels. And those all make some sense. Instantly, so this data you can't find this data on, it's not the same as the data that DBED reports. These are our estimates of what the revised jobs data will be when it's finally released in March. And so they end up being a little bit different. We get a little bit higher growth rate for jobs in 2022. So with the job market still in recovery and businesses still reporting a very hard time finding workers, even as the economy slows, to the extent that it's possible, businesses will want to hoard workers. Right? If you've been struggling to find a worker to keep your restaurant open, and you hear this all the time from restaurants that have had to reduce their hours because they can't find enough employees, it's going to take an awfully significant decline in economic activity for you to be willing to let workers go, right? Because you know how hard it is to get them back. So that's one of the explanations for why we think Hawaii's economy can avoid a recession. The other is we're still in the midst of a recovery of some sectors of tourism. So this is another one of these index charts that shows everything relative to 2020. In this case, I'm doing it relative to January because by February, people were already starting to be aware that something was going on, and we could have seen it show up some in the visitor numbers. So anyway, I'm comparing to January 2020, and you can see that U.S. arrivals since the summer of 2021, right, when U.S. visitors were driving U-Hauls to Hana, we have been at over 10% higher than 2019 and early 2020 levels for U.S. visitors. In contrast, Canadian visitors didn't really recover until this summer. Right? They still had travel restrictions last winter with Omicron, and they're not completely recovered. They're up in the 80% range. So this is 100, this is 80. So they've been in the mid 80s, 85% of where they were pre-pandemic. So basically everybody else, not counting Japanese. So that's primarily New Zealand, South Korea, Australia, all other Asia, not China, not Japan. There's Japan. So, and that's data through November, and the line right here is what we forecast for the fourth quarter. So once again, we over forecast Japanese visitors. That we think they'll probably end up for the whole quarter at around 19%. Maybe we'll get to 20. Our forecast was 25%, and it was 50% recovery by the third quarter of 2023. We'll be surprised if we get there at this point. And actually, we shouldn't be surprised because they're facing a headwind, a hurricane force headwind on costs. And these are currencies. And again, another one of those graphs where I line everything up at 100. And in this case, in January of 2020, January of 2020. And so what that means is if I look at the blue line, the dark blue line, it's 100 in January of 2020, and it got down to 75 in summer of 2022. That means that their currency was worth 25% less in the summer. It's recovered somewhat. Same kind of behavior for the Korean won. The Canadian dollar and the Australian dollar are much more stable. But so the point is imagine you're a Japanese visitor, and in the spring of, you're looking at a trip, you booked a trip, a vacation for Golden Week in 2020. You got your room, you got your airfare, you booked your tours, maybe you booked your wedding pictures, right? And then, of course, you don't come. Now, you're looking at 2023, right? You haven't been here at all. You really want to come, right? There's pent-up demand. But you look at the hotel room rates, they're plus 30%. You look at food, it's plus 20%, 15 to 20%. You look at cars, they're up 15, 20%. And you look at your currency, right? So you look at all those prices are up 20 to 30%. Now add on to that your currency buys 25% less. So you're facing a vacation that's 40, 50, 60% more expensive. So it really shouldn't be any surprise that even when the travel restrictions were relaxed, we haven't seen, basically we've got pent-up demand over here, crazy high prices over here, and they're offsetting each other. So we're not getting that kind of boost that we had hoped for. It's showing up in small amounts. In some properties are reporting pretty high bookings. We saw a little bit of bump for the holidays, not nearly what we expected. And so we have this really delicate balance in our forecast because our forecast calls for U.S. visitors to decline. There's no reason to think that U.S. visitors will continue to grow from where they are right now. Right? The conditions, so this is 2019, here's the pandemic surge, right? This is summer of 2021, and these conditions have all changed now, right? Everything costs more. U.S. visitors can go anywhere they want in the world now, right? In the summer of 2021, they could only come here, basically. And they're facing high single-digit inflation. They're facing higher interest rates. They're facing a slowly, gradually weakening labor market, higher costs across the board. There's just no reason to think that they will grow significantly from where they are, and we think they'll decline as the U.S. economy goes into recession. So in order for the overall tourism to continue to grow, it has to be offset by growth in other sectors, and particularly Japan. The non-U.S., non-Japan visitor is already up at relatively high levels, not as high as they were in 2019. So our forecast for Japan is almost enough to offset the weakening of U.S. visitors. We actually get over the next 2 years around $1 billion drop in visitor spending in real dollars, not necessarily in nominal dollars. So the visitor spending, we expect that the loss of visitor spending will be offset by growth in construction spending. And I'll show you some of the details about that. Unlike the sort of surprise growth in U.S. visitors that we've been seeing year after year or month after month, in the rest of the economy, the surprises have been mostly negative, particularly on the interest rate front, which I mentioned at the start of the presentation. These are mortgage rates. That's actually our last forecast, our third quarter forecast. Our fourth quarter forecast is about the same, but there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty here. Our forecast has mortgage rates coming down pretty quickly, but staying above 5% for the next 3 or 4 years. And what those mortgage rates have done is they have destroyed anything approximating affordability. So this graph shows two different things. The blue line, so this is the median single-family home price on Oahu. And I mean, I could show the exact same chart for each of the other islands. It would tell the same story, but in slightly different numbers. The gold line here is if you take a median household, so a family earning the median family income, and you use a conventional mortgage, and you make a wild assumption that they've got 20% down. You can change that to 5%. The graph won't look that much different. Then the gold line tells you how much house they could qualify for. And so if you look at where we were right before the pandemic, the median family could buy almost the whole home, right? They could qualify for a 680, maybe more like 780. $780,000 home. And much of that surge in affordability happened because interest rates went to 2%. And now it's completely reversed. So now we're talking about the median household being able to qualify for about a $500,000 home. And our forecast is that home prices will fall. They already have fallen. From their peak in the summer until now, they've fallen maybe 4%. Right? Our forecast is that they'll fall another 4 or 5%. Not enough to completely solve that affordability problem. The challenge from the overall economy is that this drop in affordability will hit residential building. Right, so we're focusing on the macroeconomy. How much does the economy grow? How many jobs there are? And when demand dries up, so sales of existing homes on Oahu and on the neighbor islands have fallen about 40%. In October, November, year over year. If you look at the sales number, they're down where they were back during the great financial crisis. So we're talking about number of homes being sold hasn't been this low since 2009. So, and now those are existing homes, but the same thing is happening for new homes. You talk to the builders, whether it's D.R. Horton or Castle, they don't have long lines of people lining up to buy homes anymore because they can't qualify for them, right? Or they're playing wait and see. They're saying, these mortgage rates aren't going to last forever. But the point is that that's going to slow new home construction, and that will have an overall drag on the Hawaii economy, and it will worsen the housing crisis long term. The thing that will offset that in terms of building activity and the Hawaii economy. So these are residential permits. So you can see our forecast is relatively flat. We're going to be wrong about 2022 because the last couple of months came in pretty strong. There must have been some condo towers that just got their permits approved, even though they're almost finished building. Their permit just came out. And so overall, the residential building is expected to be relatively flat. Non-residential, here it's the wedge that you care about, is growing as we look at renovations and we look at new hotel construction, for example. There's quite a bit of planned renovations or a new tower at Hilton and other parts of, certainly on Oahu, but it's really government. And this is mostly federal government. So the average amount of government contracts awarded is around $1.5 billion, federal plus state. Over the next several years, we're looking at a number that's roughly $1 billion higher than that. And that's the sense in which I think this can offset the loss of visitor spending. And this is DOD money, it's work at Pearl Harbor, it's also Infrastructure and Jobs Act money, it's all of these combined. And it's very possible that we're being too pessimistic here. Every quarter we hear of new plans for federal infrastructure, and we know that there's, so this doesn't include a stadium, right? This doesn't include moving halava or any of the things that may come out of state plans. So, I'll wrap it up here. Thinking about where we might go in the future, longer term, this pie chart shows us the share of GDP for a variety of sectors of the Hawaii economy. And the slices of the pie that are pulled out from the center, those are the only slices that saw a growth in their share over the last 20 years. Transportation, food service, healthcare, construction. All of the other sectors saw some shrinkage or no change at all. And the ones that saw growth were tied very closely. Think about what the last 20 years looked like. That was a period where we actually grew visitor arrivals and visitor spending. And it was mostly associated with a growth in short-term vacation rentals that in our forecast doesn't repeat itself. In our forecast, we assume that the short-term vacation rentals will not be any higher than they are right now for the foreseeable future. And so growth in visitor spending going forward is not very likely. I'll show you a slide about that in a moment. And so the growth has to come from somewhere else. Healthcare will continue to grow. Whether federal spending grows or not, there's a good chance it will because of defense concerns, but there are also many possible roadblocks to that. And construction spending is something that comes and goes. We're going to see that over the next 5 years, but over the next 20 years, we think that it will continue to be a growth sector because of our incredible need for infrastructure investment. But this is something that UHERO has several research projects underway right now. During the pandemic, we were fortunate enough to hire Stephen Bond-Smith, who's an expert in economic development policy, and he's got multiple projects underway that are focused on understanding what our barriers to economic diversification are. What are the policies that are in place right now that make it difficult for new activities, new business to form? And he's got a project, he's calling it the Diversification Project, imagine that, that is looking at how industries in Hawaii are related to each other and comparing that to industry structure across the entire country and eventually to other developed economies, and asking what are the pieces of an economy that you would expect to exist here that don't exist, right? So, we've got a strength in natural resources and in tourism and in ag, and so why don't we have food processing plants, right? So those kinds of questions are the focus of that research. It's in its infancy. He just started a year and a half ago, but we sort of have high hopes for that. And the reason that's important is because not only is there a concern about the number of visitors. The dark blue line here is the number of visitors, and this is what I was talking about before. The last 20 years included growth in visitors and actually some growth in visitor spending, although still, visitor spending peaked back in the early 90s. So over this time period, we saw growth in arrivals and spending, and the only reason we saw that growth in arrivals was because we added so many short-term vacation rentals. We really didn't add much to the conventional room stock. There wouldn't have been any place for these people to stay. As you see in the forecast for the near term, we don't expect any of that to repeat itself. We actually expect real visitor spending to decline, as it has over much of the history since the 90s, and we think visitor arrivals will actually be below 2019 levels all the way out in 25 and 2026. So that leaves us with a forecast for growth that's relatively, I wouldn't call it anemic, but it's basically getting us back to where we were pre-pandemic. Many of you may not realize that in 2019, this is 2019, that's Hawaii real GDP growth in 2019, almost zero. we spent the first half of the year trying to decide whether we should announce that Hawaii was in recession, and we almost were. And if you look, there's a dotted line here you can barely see. That's the average growth rate of Hawaii GDP. The Hawaii GDP is the blue bars, measured on the left axis. Over the last, from the peak of the cycle in 2007, right before the Great Recession, all the way to the peak before the pandemic in 2019, we grew on average 0.9%. So that's total Hawaii GDP growth. And basically, there's no reason to think that we're going, given the way things are going right now, that's going to change, right? So that's sort of where we're headed. A relatively, after you get the bump in growth because of recovery, we sort of go right back to that 1% growth rate. And I know I was long-winded. I apologize for that. And I'll turn it over to, we're doing Eugene next, then we do Q&A?
I'm sorry that, I thought it was Dr. Tian that had to leave early, but it's you that have to leave early. So.
Yeah, but I got it moved back to 10:30, so I think we're
Okay, so I think we're good right now. So we'll move on to Dr. Tian if you're ready. And then we'll do Q&A after. I think your presentation, Dr. Tian, is about 30 minutes.
Is it coming?
You're on. Share your screen.
You have to share your screen through Zoom, please.
Okay. Retrieve the screen.
All right, now it's you.
Good morning, Chair Yamashita and Vice Chair Kitagawa and the members of the committee. Happy New Year. I will go quickly because some of my slides are a little duplicate. And I also want to leave more time for BNF. And the director, Salabaria, is economist himself. He can answer all your questions. I will go with the economic forecast for the world. So you can see that the U.S. economy, the forecast, there are some good news. Our forecast was released at the end of November, but in the last month, the economic condition didn't change much. The only thing changed is the U.S. economy is getting better. In November, the 2022 forecast for U.S. economy was 1.8%. For 2023 was 0.2%. So basically, 2023 will be a recession, as Carl mentioned. But in December, the forecast agencies, there are 50 of them, they increased the 2022 growth rate and also increased the growth rate for 2023 by just 10 percentage points. So you can see that the forecast for 2023 is almost all decrease, especially for the European countries. And for Hawaii, I have some historical data to show. For the last 20 years, 1999 to 2009, I think Carl shows from 2007 to 2019. Our 20 years growth for GDP is about 1.9%. Real income is about 1.9%. Inflation 2.5. So you can see our inflation now is high, and the job growth is 1%. Unemployment rate is 4.1%. That is a natural rate, and currently we are higher. And we are coming in 2022. We are actually coming to the average with about 3.6%, and next year will be about 3.5%. The visitor arrival in the last 20 years, 2.1%, and we lost about 75% of our visitor count. So which means that we only remain 25%. Let me go with the DBAT forecast at the end of November, we actually forecasted a loss in population, and we have been lost population in the last 5 years. So since 2017, we lost population maybe 5 years in a row. The Census Bureau will revise the estimate. The Census Bureau does census every 10 years, but in between, they do estimate. According to the estimate, we still lost population in 2022. And the only difference between UHERO and DBAT is on tourism. So we share the same view for 2022, it's about 9.3 million visitors. But UHERO estimated that the Japanese recovery will be slow, and the US will be down. And we know US will be down. Our forecast is US visitor arrival will be down for the next few years. But the recovery from Japan, we forecasted 2023 will be recovered by 52%. And 2024 will recover by 75%. By 2025 will be fully recovered. So you can see our visitor forecast will be fully recovered by 2025. But our job won't be recovered until after 2025. From the previous recession in 2008, it took 5 years for our tourism to recover. It took 7 years for our job count to recover. We expect the same pace for our current economic recession. Overall, our economic recovery is about 95% in terms of real gross domestic product. I have what by county, so you can see Carl talk about the labor force. Labor force including people employed and people not employed but actively looking for jobs. So the recovery from the first 11 months is about 98.4%. But the job count recovery is 92.5%. So we still have a lot of, I think this Carl you explained, one is because the multiple jobs, people only holding the first job. So this is a difference between employment labor force and job count. Labor force employment is body count. No matter how many jobs you hold, you count once. But the job count, if you have 2 jobs, you count twice. So even you have a part-time job, you count twice. That's why the job count is, recovery is small, it's 92.5%. So one is the multiple job holders. I think secondly, it may be more people moving out of state. I think look at the by county, Hawaii County is doing better than others. It's mainly because Hawaii County is less tourism dependent. Honolulu County mainly is the building permit is below the 29 level, is actually declining. And also visitor arrivals, the recovery is only 78.2%. But the neighbor island counties is over 95% recovery. So Honolulu County building permit is the one drives the construction permit down. But it is very promising. In the summer last year, we knew the building permit issuance was done by over 30%. But in the last 3 months, it increased a lot. So as of the end of November, the building permit issuance decreased by 10.9%. Is a big catch-up. So I think the construction with the improvement in the staff in the DPP, the building permit department, and neighbor island counties, they have improved their building permit registration system. I think this all done, and I hope that the building permit issuance will increase. So we see this state general excise tax increase 20 months in a row. Every month, every single month is double digit. For the data, I have the latest data is November 2022. The increase was 14.6%. We use the GET as the comprehensive measure of the economy because of the GE tax is reflect the activities of business activities. So this part of this is inflation, and part of this is the economic growth. Inflation for commodities is about 10%. inflation for services is about 4.6%. So you can feel that the inflation impact overall is less than 10%. But the increase is about 19%. So it's over 10% is due to economic growth. We see the bankruptcy has been declining 3 years in a row, even during the pandemic. For 2022, it's decreased by almost 20%. The year prior was 22.5%. And we see labor market. I share some same chart as Carl, but we just use a different base. He used February 2020, I used January 2020. So you can see that the tourism-related industries, their recovery is falling behind other than the food services. And non-tourism is, especially the financial services, is declining. Even currently, it's continued to decrease. And we see the black line is actually the state, local government is also not recovered. It's mainly because there are a lot of people retired from the state jobs, and state has a lot of job opening, and it's not filled. So the state is actively recruiting for positions. I hope your legislature will not cut those positions. They are actively looking, is recruiting under currently. And look at the month of November, compared with November 2019, we still have 42,400 jobs need to be recalled. That's what we lost. For the November, the job recovery was 93.6%. So if you buy industry, you can see that we have construction is doing good, 99%. The one I highlighted, the yellow, those industries, they are below 90%. Those include wholesale trade, retail, transportation, utilities, financial activities. And so those industries are still not reached the 90%. And if we look at the unemployment rate, it's improving pretty good. So you can see that currently in November, we are at about 4.1%, 4% for the state. The last 20 years, the average is 4.1%. So we are on the average. All the counties are similar. And we look at the average weekly initial unemployment claims. This is an indicator. It's pretty much we have only about 2 weeks lag. Then it shows that the average weekly initial unemployment for the statewide is about the same as the 2019 level. But for Oahu, is higher. It's not so much higher than the 2019 level, but for neighbor island counties, it's pretty much is normal. So for the Hawaii county is 170 a week, for Maui 150, for Kauai is 54. It's only Oahu is higher. And look at the job vacancies. We do have some labor shortage. You can see starting 2021, we have a big gap. That means there are opening, there's hires, and the gap means is unfilled, is vacancy. So you can see the vacancy is large in 2021, but it's getting closer. So for the month of November, we still have about 11,000 vacancies need to be filled, but the gap is getting closer. In terms of construction, we do have a decrease 10.9% in the building permit volume, but all the categories, residential, commercial, additions, alterations, is decreased. And to show you that the private residential home authority is actually decreased, especially on Oahu. So the decrease is over 50%. So it's about a half, less than half. If you look at the 3 quarters 21, 3 quarters 2022, 21 is a year that's very significant. We have so many homes sold. It's over 20,000 homes sold. And we have so many homes get permitted. So you can see for the whole state is over 5,000 homes were permitted. So for the first 9 months, Honolulu is actually decreased, and other counties decrease very small. to reflect, because of those value of building permit, it has inflation. Construction inflation is over 10%. So deflating the inflation, we see the private building permit is declining, but we see a big increase in the government. As Carl mentioned, is mainly is the federal government for the Pearl Harbor improvement, and it's about $10 billion, and Hawaii get about half of them. And it's pretty big. If you look at the left scale, you can see that is 2.5 billion. And for the private, is only about 1 billion. So also the state DOT issue a building permit on the Big Island. So that is a big construction project, is over $2 billion. And that's for the highway, it takes several years. And if we look at the real estate, you see the closed sales, the number of sales is almost double digit for all the counties, except Oahu condo is less than double digit. But the price is continue to increase. This is for the first 11 months. So the price continue to increase for both single family and condo homes. And we look at the price for the homes, Oahu, Maui, Kauai, they are pretty similar. You look at the single family, and condo price is lower than the single family. So that is a general understanding. But for Hawaii County, it's very different. It's half of the other counties, but for the condo price and single family, they are the same. So that's Hawaii County actually attract more people going there to buy properties. I can show you later. So you can see this 25% of our homes were purchased by out of state. So you can see the mainlander, now more mainlanders coming to buy homes from Hawaii. So you can see the increase for 2022, the first 9 months, it became 22.9%. It's almost 23%. It's an increase from the last few years. And international is also increasing. It's become 2.2% from the last few years, less than 2%. By county, you can see that I have a 10 years comparison, 2012 home sales. You can see the Honolulu is, the local purchase is declining, but for significance is actually for Maui County and Kauai County. So in 2012, it's less than about 50% is purchased by local residents. And now is over 60% is purchased by local residents. So I think that is a good sign. Our local residents purchasing more properties. But overall in the state, we have about 25% purchased by out-of-state residents. For the residents, non-residents purchase, foreigners, is mainly from Canada and Japan. If you look at the condo, it's about 24, it's about 80, about 74% from those two countries, Canada and Japan. Same pattern for single families. So Japanese like to purchase homes on Oahu. Canadian like to purchase homes on Maui. So it's mainly because tourism driven. There are more flights coming to Maui from Canada. And we see the local residents, the purchase by local residents is high at the low end. So it's less than 1 million for a single family. For mainlander and foreigner, especially the foreigner, is over $3 million, the average price. Same pattern for the condo price. Tourism, our forecast for 2022 is 9.3, the same as UHERO, and our forecast for 23 is 9.8. But the visitor spending is higher, even for this year, for 2022, is higher than 2019. It's mainly because of the inflation. And this chart is similar to what Carl shows, that if we deflate by the price index, our real visitor spending is actually still below the 1988 level. So 1988 level, we have about nearly 20 billion And even in 2019, we are below 19 billion. It's mainly because of the inflation. You can see part of the inflation is the hotel room rate. Just compare with 2019, the red part is the room rate compared with 2019 is 31.9% statewide. For the neighbor island counties, is even higher. Oahu is 11%, but for Maui County is 54%. Big Island is about 51%. Kauai is about 42% increase. Because when visitors spend more on hotels, they spend less on retail. So that's why you see the retail industry, the recovery is below 90%. And I think that is the reason, because the hotel room rate increased a lot. You look at the 2022 Maui County, the hotel room rate per night is over $600 per night. And look at the visitor recovery. I think one thing I look at it, I was very excited is look at that Oahu, November 2022. It's over 90% recovery. That is a good, because Oahu visitors is about 50-50. 50 domestic, US mainland, 50 international. International recovery is only about 38%. We have Canadians recovery is 72% for Canadian, 72%. For Japanese recovery is only 11%. So overall international is about 38%. But Oahu in November is doing good, is over 90%. But it varies by the island. So we see that Molokai is overall is still lower, Lanai is still lower, but Hawaii Island, Kauai, and Maui Island, they are doing pretty good. In terms of visitor by market area, we compare 2019 before the pandemic and 2022. So 67% in 2019 from US, and now it's 85% from the US. So this is the difference in forecast by market. You can see the US market, we share the same view with the UHERO, will be a decrease from the US in the next few years, 2023, 24, 25, our forecasting. But we do see an increase from Japan. From Japan will be enough. I think Carl was saying the increase from Japan will barely make up the loss in US. But our forecast is it will be offset, more than offset the loss in the US. So that's why we forecast about a big increase. It's over 800,000 in 2023. That represents 52% recovery and 75% recovery in 2024 and full recovery in 2025. This is the air seat. I look at the air seat from the airline schedule this morning. You do see from the US, it's going to be slowing down. For January, 3.1%. This is number of seats. And February is slowed down to 0.7%. In March, it's going to decrease. But we do see the 300, 400% increase from Japan. So that means it's about 45% recovery from the 2019 level for the first quarter. I think the increase will be larger for the following quarters. Inflation, I have two slides. You can see since July, for both the US and Hawaii, is declining. So the most recent month is November. We have 5.8%. And for US, it's 7.1%. That is a good sign because this will help the construction, will help the real estate. And a good driver, a big driver for the inflation is the energy price, oil price. You can see Hawaii is pretty much stable, although we are declining. But the US varies a lot, increase and decrease. It's mainly because our inventory, and we change the source of our oil purchase. This is the last slide. I will stop. I'll be happy to answer any questions. If you don't have questions, go to Salvaria. He knows everything about what I'm talking about.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, members, this is where we open up to questions. I think we have enough time. Dr. Bonham said he had to leave at 10:30, so half an hour should be more than enough. So you can ask either one of them any questions. Yeah, Representative Morikawa.
Thank you. When you did your forecast, did you guys, I kind of heard it, but the baby boomers are a big part of the population. Many have retired, some have passed on, and their properties obviously go to their dependents. So have you guys taken that into consideration where the property changes or it becomes up for sale and someone else buys it?
So that's not something that,
Because this is on YouTube, can you talk in the mic, please? And then,
so we haven't taken into account aging population in terms of an effect on home sales or availability of housing. And actually, I mean, we do take the aging population into account in our overall economic forecast, right? So we have a population forecast that is actually continuing to decline for the next 2 years statewide in our forecast. I would suggest that we may actually be seeing something a little bit different than what you had in mind, which is that because aging baby boomers are staying in their homes longer than, say, their parents did, that what we're seeing is a lack of turnover in housing, right? There's less mobility than has been true in the past, and then that basically eats into availability of supply. Another, what may even be the biggest thing that's affecting us in the very near term is the fact that any of the houses that sold or refied in the last 2 years, those people are kind of stuck now. They can't move because if they move, they'd be going from a 2.5% interest rate to a 6% interest rate. And so the reduced mobility is then impacting inventory. So if you look at inventories of homes right now, they haven't risen nearly as much as you would have expected, given how much demand has dropped off, as people aren't putting their homes on the market. But that's a good point. We will think about that.
Thank you.
We also didn't, we actually don't do the housing price or housing inventory forecast. I believe that the inventory has a pretty big proportion is from the people getting old and they want to sell their properties. And I think Hawaii, we are one of the oldest state in terms of percentage of old population, 65 and above. So I think we rank 7th highest in the nation. So there are a lot of, we didn't look at the home ownership by age, but I do believe that there is a higher proportion of the homes coming from old age people.
And I'm sure that also affects the job market, right? Because a lot of the baby boomers are no longer wanting to work a second job or third job or what have you.
Exactly.
Thank you.
So one thing to keep in mind is that since the end of 2019, population in the state has declined by over 10,000 people. And so some of those people retired, some of them just left the labor force and moved, right? And so those people aren't available to be in the labor force.
Thank you.
okay, thank you very much. Anybody else? Questions? Yeah. Representative Kahalo. Proceed.
Mahalo, Chair. Mahalo for your presentation. Very interesting. Some parts that are good things that we're doing from our economic outlook compared to national averages and the rest of the world, but, some things to really consider. I was intrigued by the comments about economic diversification and food processing. So Dr. Bonham, I wanted to see if there were more comments on economic diversification with other sectors that potentially can help our economy, if you can speak to that, and or diving into how food processing, like you mentioned, or ag and food systems, is that enough of a growth to make an impact, or how can we grow other sectors, whether it's further support and or see new economic sectors as we move forward, understanding that the job not that many jobs openings are available, but can we look at other sectors here in Hawaii?
So, I wish I had a better answer for you. What I was talking about, so the food processing was just an example. And it was intended, I think it's a good example because it reflects something that's missing and that we should be able to address. And so the research that Dr. Bond-Smith is doing really is to identify, it's a data-driven effort to identify the pieces of our economy that you would think would be here, given the existing structure. So it looks at where we are and it says what seems to be missing, and then it asks why, right? And part of that, of the role for that research is to go to the community and say, can you explain to us why this isn't here? So it's data-driven, but also community-driven, and then policy focused. So what policies could change those things? Unfortunately, it's not done. So we hired Dr. Bond-Smith a year ago, and he spent most of the last year getting to know more about Hawaii. And he comes to us with a lot of experience in economic development for small regional economies. He's from New Zealand, and he spent the last 5 years in Western Australia studying what is an economy that's very remote, not as remote as we are, but very remote, relatively small, and very intensive in natural resources, right? So very similar to Hawaii, when very concentrated, and has done research that asks what policies change that. So I guess what I would encourage is to have Dr. Bond-Smith come back and address these things. All of these will be small, right? Because once you move out of our sort of strong clusters in tourism and in things like insurance. So Hawaii has a relatively strong traded cluster in insurance, in transportation, logistics. Once you get out of those, the sectors all become very small. And so they can make a difference, and you have to address all of them, right, to deal with the need to continue to diversify the economy. Sorry, I didn't have a great answer for you, but.
Just to follow up, when can we anticipate some of that research to be available to us before we ask him to address our?
So right now the plan is that by the end of this coming semester, so we actually just hired a graduate student who started in January to start working on it with him, and the goal is to start producing some research reports and blog posts later, so May, June. And we'll move it along as fast as we can. It's going to be a multi-year research agenda. So.
Mahalo.
Okay, anybody else? Any questions, Representative Kobayashi?
Would either of you like to predict what Council on Revenues might say next week and March? Upward, downward, strong, weak, upward.
So I usually make a habit of not trying to predict what the council will predict. And actually, I asked that we have this meeting after the council meeting. I think there's some risk that the growth rate for this year is going to go down because of just purely accounting, right? Because the tax refunds weren't originally in our forecast last time. They weren't treated as tax revenue or loss of tax revenue, and they were thought of as an expenditure, which they were. But from a purely accounting perspective, the growth rate will be lower. But we can wait and see till tomorrow.
Will it be negative?
I don't think it will be. No.
Good, thank you. What about March? Well, that's all
So
right.
the forecasts that I submit to the council don't include negative numbers for this coming fiscal year.
Okay. Thank you. Anybody else? Questions? Representative, please.
Dr. Bonham, thank you for the presentation. Great information as always. I know we haven't heard from Director Salaveria just yet, but in terms of the surplus, I think we're looking at about 2.2, 2.3 billion. If we are looking at a recession on the horizon, even if it is a modest one, if you could be finance director for a day, any counsel on how you would earmark that money to help us with our continued economic recovery?
Put me on the spot there. So, actually, some of the discussions and announcements that I've seen so far make sense to me, and not just from the new administration, from the previous administration. Putting some money in rainy day clearly makes sense. Paying down unfunded liabilities. I'm a relatively cautious person, and I think that's warranted. I think taking into account the possibility of a slowdown nationally is important.
Anybody else? Representative Poy.
Thank you, Chair. So from the first presentation, I'm looking at the industry shares of 2019 GDP. Just curious if you're able to break out the data for the small business and even micro enterprise business sector of our local economy.
So that data is in that pie chart, right? So, and so could you break that into small business? I don't think you can. I don't think we actually have the information that we would need to do that. But it would be true that we can look at the share of jobs, for example, that are for small businesses and very small businesses, and so you could do kind of a back of the envelope calculation to try to figure that out. I haven't done that.
Anybody else? Okay, Dr. Tian, well, anybody. So I have a couple questions. So you know our job market right now, right? Everybody is short workers, and so even when you talk about growth, and Representative Morikawa brought up a good point about the baby boomers may not be in the workforce anymore. I always thought that our housing market, there's a lot of appetite from out of state. I question if they're coming in to be part of the workforce or to retire. I think it's the latter. And then, so that could be affecting what percentage of the workforce or the population can be in the workforce or will be in the workforce, and what percentage we have to service, and that could be part of the problem. And also that, because of the pandemic, is there people out there that have learned to live with less, and that's why maybe the second job is not as important? Is that part of the problem? I think, I haven't looked at it lately, but usually there's a big spread on the U6 numbers as far as underemployed. And when you look at all those things in totality, can you give me like an idea of what's going to happen as far as our workforce, and, well, how does all that come into play, I guess?
Okay, I will start, and Carl can have his view. I think we have a labor shortage. I think mainly is because it's in different industries, like in the healthcare, medical services. You can see that the recovery is less than 100%, although they are 99, 98%. We don't have applicants. We don't have candidates. So there are openings, but nobody applying those positions. So that is one reason we really have shortage in the registered nurses and physicians. Hawaii, I think we have more registered nurses working on the mainland. They register in Hawaii, but working on the mainland. And almost half of the physicians, they are Hawaii registered, but practice elsewhere. I think that is we want to do a study to see why these people leaving the state and working elsewhere in the country. And even in the tourism, we see a lot of openings in the tourism industry. We also see a lot of people looking for jobs. They were retired or laid off during the pandemic from tourism. I think maybe it's because they don't have a good match, because in occupation, they were receptionists and they don't want to go back to the receptionist. Or they were receptionists and now they are looking for someone like room cleaning or maintenance. So there is a mismatch in the occupation. And also we don't have, I think in the tourism, there are two. One is healthcare, one is the tourism, hospitality sector. We also have more opening and more people looking for jobs, but they couldn't find it. That is a different, for Maui, for example, in terms of visitor recovery, is almost recovered. But if you look at the job recovery, it's 90%. So even in the tourism, it's about 90%. So that means the people in the tourism industry, they are more productive. With fewer workers, they serve more visitors. So I think that is and a lot of people, they laid off or in the tourism industry, they don't want to go back to the same industry. They are looking for different jobs, and they are looking for higher pay, flexible working arrangement, or flexible hours. I think that's one thing. I think in terms of the other thing, like the home purchases by out-of-state residents, and I think very little. I think most of them are using as the investment, and are using them as a second homes. Investment, they will rent it to local residents or rent it to visitors, or they use by themselves as a second home. And we didn't do a study, but I think it's a good question to look at it. Those people, did they impact our labor force? So that we need to do a survey. So we'll keep that in mind. I think currently, my hypothesis is that the proportion coming to our labor force is small, but we need to test it, see if it is true. And I think that is my answer. Maybe Carl can add more to your other questions.
Please.
So I just looked up the U6, and it's fallen sharply from 20% to 7.6%. And that's still higher than it has been.
Closer to 5, right?
Yeah, it's actually was probably higher than this during the Great Recession at this stage in the process, because that one sort of lingered for so long. The labor, so Eugene was talking about matching, right? So having a mismatch between the kinds of jobs that are open, the kinds of openings that are available, and the jobs that people want. And that can happen for a whole variety of different ways, but the pandemic led to so many changes, from the 15,000 or so people who moved from the state, or the reduction in our population, presumably a relatively large number of people working in service sectors, in hotels or in food service, who weren't from Hawaii. When they lost their job in March of 2020, there was no prospect. By summer of 2020, you kind of knew that this was going to be a really long haul, and so those people have left, right? You can't stay in Hawaii and live without a job, right? If you don't have family to rely on. And so now, who's going to fill those same jobs? So there's a matching problem, and those people aren't coming back, right? Because the national economy recovered so much faster than Hawaii did, that job availability just it didn't exist in, say, spring of 2021 in Hawaii, and even in fall of 2021 and now, our labor market is weaker than the national one. So it makes sense that we would have these mismatches that will take time to work out. Having said that, if you look at the labor shortage, so if you look at job openings relative to the labor force, the labor market is really not any tighter than it was, or it's not much tighter than it was in 2018 and 2019. And so that leads me to, back then, people were saying the same thing, right? So if you think back to 2018 and 2019, I don't remember the exact details, but for some reason I needed to go to Walmart in Kona. And I can't remember why, but I called Walmart in Kona. And the answering machine starts off with, "We're hiring," right? And if you want a job, leave your number or something like that. And it's not dramatically worse now, but the matching is much worse. And so that's why you'll hear so many businesses talk about not being able to fill those jobs. And I mentioned earlier that the labor force is only 1.5 percentage points below where it was in 2019. So, and population is lower. So the labor force to population ratio is higher now, or very close to where it was in 2019. The problem is getting people back in, and as I said earlier, I think a lot of it's second jobs, and I think a lot of it is related to whether you're caring for someone who is sick or you're dealing with long COVID yourself. I mean, the numbers are definitely big enough to explain some of this.
So my other question was that, and this is just me doing my own survey, driving around, looking at retail. It seems to be a lot of them are empty or closing, and it seems like, and I tried to look for a retail breakout, but I didn't see one in your reports. But food service is expanding, and so the spaces that were retail are converting to food service, and so the job demands are different there and things like that. But I'm just wondering your opinion of what's happening there. I assume a lot of it is online spending and things like that, but and then how is that affecting our economy and what's going to happen to our retail space going forward? Do we have too much retail space, or?
So there were some numbers in the slides that showed retail. So the job numbers that I was showing, retail was lagging behind. It was one of the least recovered. Finance, Eugene and I both mentioned finance and real estate, rental leasing. Both of those are lagging. And in our forecast, we have retail lagging. And so basically the pandemic accelerated all of these trends that were already in existence, right? The online shopping accelerated dramatically. And much of that won't go away, right? So, we'll still be doing, whether it's with Amazon's new facility, whether things are going to get here even faster, or whether we're going to keep shopping for our produce online with farm-to-table type programs. All of those reflect what Eugene was talking about, increased productivity, right? So you can sell the same goods in a different way, and it may mean less of a need for brick and mortar space. And so actually there may be an opportunity going forward. You've heard conversations about converting office space into housing. You think about the old malls, the old Maui Mall. Why isn't that housing, right? Why hasn't that been converted into, maybe there's some different kinds of retail in the bottom, and it's 4 floors of housing on the top. And some of that is regulation. Some of it has to do with how difficult it is to make those transitions. And that's actually something that where policy could make a difference. If you just basically make it easier to do multifamily housing, and across Oahu too. You think about old retail space that's underutilized outside of Kaka'ako, where you can put up 4 stories of multifamily housing. I know I changed the subject a little bit, but we were talking about using up of,
Right,
using space, and
Okay, so that leads me to my next question. So right, because I think there's less demand for brick and mortar retail space. And so when we look at the redevelopment of the stadium and it's an opportunity zone, I've always wondered if we create retail or we create things like that, will you put other spaces, create other problems in the
Sure.
outlying area and things like that? And, so, and how's that gonna work? And, so I'm wondering, is it a timing thing? Should we delay it because of this current situation?
so I'm not sure that would be what would cause me to delay.
Well, not the stadium part now.
Yeah.
The redevelopment of the.
But those problems will work themselves out, right? The existing retail space still has value, but it may take time because it has to be repositioned. And I'm not sure that would cause me to change my plans. I think it would be more important that what you do is try and increase flexibility. I mean, you could even, I don't want to suggest an incentive, but increase the flexibility in how you renovate, how you repurpose existing retail space. This is not a new problem. And so a stadium or a pandemic can both have effects that just accelerate the process that was already underway. And to me, the problem is that we make it so hard to take an old shopping center and turn it into housing. That's the problem, not that we're gonna, and the other point is that at the stadium, I think that's gonna be a relatively high-end, not high-end retail, but it's going to be competing with places like Ala Moana or destination retail, less so than, say, mom and pop retail in an aging retail space, like an aging strip mall, for example.
Okay, thank you. Representative Kobayashi.
Dr. Dion, you mentioned that the tourism spending has changed and that more is being spent on hotels and hence less on other sectors of tourism spending. Is that change permanent or likely to continue?
Yeah, I think this is related to Rep. Yamashita's question about the retail. I think 10 years ago, the visitors spent about 30% of their budget on hotels, and now they spend 45%. So they will spend fewer on retail. I think that's one of the reasons the retail job decrease and the retail sales is not booming. A second reason is that the online sales. Even for local residents, a lot of is increasing proportion of the purchases is from online rather than going to the stores. But we do have, I think, for the retail development in the future, I think it may be better. We have some models like the Rainbow Drive-In, Leonard, Malasadas, those ones. I think it may be better is focus on tourism. Those ones, they become a famous store online, so they come here to enjoy those products. So I think that is, they will do both. A retail store here, but they have to do some marketing online, so combined with the new technology. I think that way the retail store will survive. Otherwise, there will be always a substitute, because we have a fixed amount of income for local residents.
Yes, of course.
And if we buy from A, we will buy less from B. And for example, we see Sears is gone, and we see Kmart is gone, and it's because of the other big box retailers. So for a retail store is the same. I think we may want to focus on the product that will be more tourism oriented because the visitors are changing. We have 10 million visitors in 2019, but the visitors are rotating. It's not the same person, right?
Okay, so given that there is a shift in how tourists spend their money, it seems that this shift in tourism spending has a negative impact on local residents. That is, we no longer have as many hotels owned locally. I mean, I'm thinking about Outrigger and the Aston Hotels and the Seaside chain on the major, neighbor islands are no longer locally owned. So you have a twofold effect, I think. One, that if there are profits in the hotel industry, some of it may not stay in Hawaii. And secondly, because there is less spending by tourists in the non-hotel sector, that the trickle-down effect to local residents is negative. And I would think that that would be continued into the future, so long as our hotels take up this now larger share of the tourism dollar. Is that correct?
Yes, I think that would be the trend in the future. So I think the retail store will have to restructure or change their business pattern. But I think for the residents, there are two parts. I think one is general residents like me. I'm not a business owner, not a store operator. So general residents has views on tourism, and we do surveys. My office does surveys on the residents' view. We call the resident settlement survey on their view on general tourism. I think the results show that about 50%, about 50-50 in favor of tourism, 50% saying too much tourism. And for store owners, you are talking about the ownership of those hotels, the shopping centers. But those businesses, we treat them as Hawaii businesses in terms of our government data, like the labor data or the businesses. They are Hawaii businesses. They hire people, Hawaii people, and they pay the Hawaii residents. I think you are right that in the leakage. If the ownership is out of state, there will be more leakage in terms of the we call the business profit. After paying all our residents, they still have profit. Some other profit may be leaked out of state. So that leakage, we actually in the GDP we have some estimate on the leakage.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Representative Lamasau, followed by Representative Kila, then Representative Ward.
Sorry, Dr. Bonham. This question's for you before you leave. We've been talking about tourism, but I understand there's some talk about green fees, and I wanted to see if there's anyone working on any impact study on green fees on our tourism industry and economy.
So there are several reports on the UHERO website that address whatever we're going to call it, a green fee, and I believe they're all authored by Jim Mack. And last one was probably in November. That might have been the one that was focused on tourism governance, on HTA and tourism management. And I mean, the primary thing that he's raising, or one of the primary things, or several, is the constitutionality of imposing basically a head tax on visitors. So we confront the issue of whether or not we're basically treating visitors differently when it comes to interstate trade. And these things have shown up in court hearings for Alaska and other places. And in contrast to a fee, say, when you go to a park, so let's say we actually charged what it was really worth to go to Hanauma Bay, right? So if you've ever been to an aquarium in Seattle or in Vancouver, and I'm not suggesting Hanauma Bay is an aquarium, but it's better, right? But you could pay $75 to go into the aquarium at Vancouver, right? And we could be charging that much at Hanauma Bay, and it would be constitutional. You could charge that, and you could waive that fee for locals. That would probably be more effective at managing tourism, and also, I mean, if the goal is to constrain the number of visitors, a $50 fee, whether it's charged at the hotel or at the airport, is not likely to have a large impact on reducing the number of visitors. I mean, if you look at what has happened over the last several years, we've seen TAT taxes go up by 2 percentage points on all the, on all the counties, and we didn't see a big drop in. And that's a lot more than $50, right? So this is not something that we really should be thinking of it as a way to cover the costs of managing tourism and dealing with negative repercussions of tourism on our environment. And so the key is, can you do that in a way that's constitutional and where the money goes to the issue at hand? And I think doing it at the source of the problem makes good sense so having DLNR address these things. The other thing is that because the state has now kept what they used to give to the counties, and the counties now have their own 2% TAT, that means we have a pool of TAT revenue in the state coffers that didn't used to be there. That money could easily be earmarked to DLNR or whatever agency we want to have in control of managing our parks, managing our open spaces, and offsetting the negative effects of tourism. And there will be another piece coming out probably in November. Once the bills start to show up, I'm sure Jim will be writing again about his views on green fees.
Sorry, is there like a projected time or month when they would come out?
So the discussions we've had is that we should wait and actually see what bills are introduced, and that he would probably comment on those rather than write one more piece about an unknown.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Representative Keelam, followed by Ward.
Dr. Bonham, I'm so sorry, I know you have to go, but you touched on something that I really talk a lot about with Representative Garrett, and you're highlighting the labor shortage is almost the same thing in purview of 2019. But something that has always astonished me is their data, for one, with the correlation, are we not providing education? Is education the barrier? Are minimum qualifications also the barrier in a modern day age? But also, is now the vacancy of these labor shortages at entry level?
Good questions. So it's all of the above. I mean, that's
Right.
kind of the mess is that, I mean, I always point to education as an incredibly important piece of what we can do for economic development, right? I mean, if you want to, so imagine if 20 years ago we had universal preschool, and we had, say, I don't want to throw that out, I'll get in trouble from David Lasner, but, so we know from years and years of research with national data that the investment in early childhood education has incredible payoff. So if we had done that 20 years ago, all of those keiki would now be grown, most of them would be in our labor force, and they would be more skilled, more productive, earning more, our economy would be more productive, and we'd have a higher GDP. So the problem is that those things take time. So getting those started now, and I know we are working on these things, is probably the best way we can improve our economy long term. right? You look for the things that have the highest rates of return on investment. That's one of them. And I think we're talking just in general about our labor force and what the challenges are, and it's all of the health concerns that I've raised, the fact that the population is shrinking. We talk a lot about brain drain. When someone decides whether they're going to stay in Hawaii, right, they're looking at the whole spectrum of issues: family, right, job, housing costs, cost of school, healthcare, all of that. And they're making comparisons between whether it's Hilo or Honolulu or Houston. And they're making these comparisons, and they're choosing where they're going to raise their family. And so all of those things matter: the affordability of housing, the quality of our schools, the job opportunities. So it's a chicken and egg problem, right? We have to have high-skilled workers, but we also have to have the jobs for them. And I would argue that over the last 10 years leading up to the pandemic, the real reason that we started to see our population stagnate and we started to be worried more and more about outflow of, this is not a new problem, but about brain drain and things like that, is it's not that we had a sudden change in the cost of housing relative to the rest of the country. It's because the rest of the country was adding jobs like crazy. They were adding anywhere you looked on the continent, you could pinpoint a place that had low unemployment and high-skilled jobs, and that wasn't true in Hawaii. And that's the sense in which this diversification research is so important, and the education part of it is so important.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Mahalo.
Thank you. Representative Ward.
Thank you, Chair, and congratulations as our new chair and for vice chair. And Dr. Bonham, you're a physician, but you spoke like a physician, but you're a PhD. The COVID and the connection of long COVID and 37,000 out of the labor force, are you sure that that's accurate? How many people have actually got long COVID? Because you've associated it with...
So the report will come out tomorrow. The last report is on our website, and this is survey data because you can no longer rely on test results because people are testing at home. Right? So we've been surveying, I think, almost 2,500 households across the state for the last 6 months to a year. And so the percentages of COVID that we're finding in our surveys are very similar. So in the last report, it was 25% of the population had tested positive for COVID. I believe in the next report that's coming out tomorrow, the number's probably higher. And the numbers that we're finding are very consistent with numbers coming out of the CDC.
But you're saying COVID or long COVID, 25%?
COVID. And
Okay.
then the percentage that have long COVID is much smaller than that, okay?
But
When you take the total population, the total labor force of 600 plus thousand, and you take 25% of that who have long COVID, and then, who've had COVID, and then you take a percentage that have long COVID, you can easily come up with a number of 30 or 40,000 people in the state that are experiencing moderate to severe long COVID.
But long COVID doesn't mean you can't work. But you're implying that that's the reason why we got to...
The numbers of people with long COVID are much higher than the unemployment rate numbers of people who aren't. It doesn't mean you can't work. I didn't say it means you can't work.
Okay.
I mean, so the severe long COVID has symptoms that would make you not go to work. Put it that way.
Plus the incentive.
And I'm arguing that this is primarily about, well, a chunk of it is probably about second jobs. So many people with long COVID are working. Right? So I'm not saying that they're all
Okay.
people who are not working. Many of them are working, but they may not have a second job back because it's just too much.
Thank you.
And these are hypotheses, right? We have some data, and so I can't prove it because it's just not, just can't do that.
That's what I was looking for, whether that factual, empirical, or hypothesis. It's a good
Well, it's
hypothesis.
a hypothesis based on
Some-
good data, but the data is survey data. It's the best we have right now.
Thank you
Okay,
very
Dr.
much.
Bonham, thank you very much for staying this long.
I have a question to Dr. Tian.
Please.
Very quickly,
proceed.
you project, Dr. Tian, 1% increase in this coming year and then a 2% increase in the population, but we've lost thousands of people in the last few years. So What's going on to say that we're gonna gain population?
I think the population decrease has been happening in the several years. Our labor, now we have a labor shortage. I think a part of it is the migration. We lost population because more people going to the mainland. In a normal year, there will be more people coming from international. But in the last few years, we have few people from international. International migration is the main source for our labor force. So we have fewer people coming from international. That's why we don't have people. We have a labor shortage. Another thing is, I think there are questions from a representative on the education. We do see there are more openings in the professional services, but we don't have people in that category looking for jobs because U.S. economy has been fully recovered in 2021. And 2022, of course, has been 2 years. But Hawaii is still recovering. Mainland, the pay is higher, more opportunities. That's why I think we see more people move to the mainland, and we see fewer coming from international.
But Dr. Tian, who is actually coming? You said they're coming. Who are they? Which countries you're talking about?
The main source of our migration is from Philippines. Philippines, China, Taiwan, so those countries.
So COVID slowed that down, now it's gonna open it back up, and that's why you're projecting.
Right.
You're not projecting that the outflow will not continue, but only that it'll be overcome by the inflow.
Yeah, it will be resolved by more international inflow in the next few years. I think our projection shows that in 2024, we'll have a population increase.
Is that a hypothesis or based upon?
It's a hypothesis.
Okay,
Yeah.
very good. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much.
Dr.
Anybody else? Representative Alco.
I thank you, Chair.
Sorry, we'll fix the mics. We gotta work on it this afternoon.
No problem, thank
We're
you.
missing a mic.
Yeah. So my question is that business owners got a big tax break, keeping the workers on payroll. And because they keep the workers on payroll, do you think and the workers can go unemployment, that's part of the shortage? Did you guys just take that in accountability and try to measure that? Because the ERC does give like 25,000, something like that to an employer, a business owner. So what's your take on that, and how do you look at it and measure that?
I think you look at the bankruptcy filing. Because of the federal assistance program helping the small businesses, you see the bankruptcy filing decrease in 2020 and 21, 22. I think that really helps the business. And when the people are unemployed, they first will look for register for unemployment insurance. That is a number we call the initial unemployment claims. We see that number become normal, similar to 2019 level. And we do see a lot of people, I think Representative Yamashita talking about the U6 and the U3. U3 is the one we're talking about 4%. But when we talk about the U6, it's 8%, close to 8%. So there is another half, is 4%, 4%. The 4% is actually the people they discourage. Discourage means that they have been looking for jobs and then they couldn't find for a certain length of time, they just gave up. Instead, they just staying home, and they are not in the labor force. They are not looking for jobs. And some of them may already move out of state. And some of them, they have a job, but they wanted a job full-time, and they end up with a part-time. And they want to be in a field, but they ended up with a different field. So those people, they called unemployment for economic reasons. So that number is high in Hawaii, is higher than the U.S. In terms of unemployment rate, we are pretty similar to the U.S., but in terms of those people unemployed due to economic reasons, we are high. We have been high in the last few years than the U.S.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, you know what, I have one quick question, and this will be the last one. So is there any data on the gig economy and people monetizing YouTube and Instagram in the state.
Yeah, we actually, we have the broadband coordinator in our department. We are planning some kind of study on that. And I think so far we don't have a good data on that. So we are planning a study to do that, to find the equity,
Okay,
digital equity.
okay, thank you. Thank you very much, and everybody thank our two presenters, and we'll move on to BNF. We deliberately took long so that maybe yours is short.
Good morning, Chair Yamashita, Vice Chair Kitagawa, members of the House Finance Committee. My name is Louis Salaveri. I'm your Director of Finance. I'm here joined by my Deputy Sabrina Nasir and our Administrator for the Program Planning and Budget Division, Mr. Neil Mihira. Thank you for the opportunity to present to you.
You're out of order.
Yeah, that was it. So, regardless what Eugene did say, I learned everything from him when I was an intern for Eugene. So please direct all economics questions to Eugene. But I am here to talk about the fiscal biennium 23-25 executive biennium budget and the multi-year financial plan. And my presentation, and you do have it in front of you, I will summarize, so we're not here for another hour. But I'd like to just really touch upon a few things, and that is the administration's approach to the 2023-25 budget, budget and fiscal considerations that we had, a synopsis of the budget, the multi-year general fund financial plan, and the federal elementary secondary school emergency relief funds and the maintenance of effort compliance. So if I start, it is a transition year. So over the past 4 weeks, your Department of Budget and Finance has been able to meet with every department to basically discuss their priorities and the incoming vision as it pertains to the upcoming administration. After reviewing everything and looking at the financial plan, it is safe to say that we do have some very healthy ending balances. And so the approach that the administration is taking place as it comes to preparing the budget is to really manage the financial plan. And in the coming weeks, it is going to be our intent to collaborate with the legislature in managing that bottom line and making sure that we continue to have ending balances throughout the entire duration of the 6-year financial plan. We've had certain budgetary and fiscal considerations in preparation of this budget. Granted, you will be seeing more initiatives as well as more expenditures coming in as we continue to meet with every one of the departments and develop those budgetary asks. But we are constantly scanning the horizon to ensure that we are aware of any issues, both positive and negative, that would rise to the attention of having to be addressed within the budget and the financial plan. The state was very fortunate over the past several years to receive a significant amount of federal funding during the pandemic. But as it stands at this point in time, we cannot rely upon that infusion for much longer. Therefore, it's really imperative that we really create what we're calling a structurally balanced budget and financial plan. And our primary objective towards that structural balance is the strong management of reserves. Admin Directive 22.1 establishes the parameters of which the state is, addresses its reserves, and we are positioning the state to strengthen that policy by requesting an additional $500 million that would be added to the state's hard emergency budget and reserve fund. This would bring our hard reserves, excluding the ending balance, to about 15% of general fund revenues. And this would allow us, the state, the legislature, to really manage our ending balances going forward. So when you look at the plan, we're much more mindful in terms of how we should be spending our money, where we should be spending our money, and how we should be kind of managing to the bottom line. There were definitely other considerations as we were looking at the overall budget and financial plan, and these things will continue to linger on, and they've been lingering on now for several years, and that's our unfunded liabilities in both the ERS and the EUTF, what's happening right now in Congress right now, and whether or not we will continue to see the kind of support that we have, especially with a divided Congress, as well as the national economy and global economy that you just heard from the two economists before me. There are definitely some operational considerations that we need to consider in preparation of the budget, and we will be asking for some cost-neutral emergency appropriations that will be needed in order to address the repeal of certain provisions in the previous session laws. Specifically, I'm talking about Section 61 and 68 that did provide for the flexibility of the administration to handle emergency-type expenditures. In preparation of the budget, it was very important to ensure that we maintain the continued statutory obligations that the administration needed to do. And in that, we really kind of wanted to address that the process be very transparent. So therefore, in preparation of the executive budget, you will find that there are requests, and it is kind of highlighted on page 6 of the presentation, but really talking about addressing some of those inconsistencies within the budget, such as conversions of unfunded budgeted positions, trade-off transfer adjustments, base budget adjustments, as well as other type of base adjustments requested to delete like underfunded or non-funded positions. So the next portion of my presentation will really kind of talk about the larger, synopsis of the biennium budget. As it stands at this point in time, and again, this will be changing over the coming weeks, the fiscal biennium 23-25 budget includes $18 billion in FY24 and $17.8 billion for all means of financing for fiscal year 25. This represents an increase of approximately $2 billion in the first year and $1.8 billion in the second year, respectively, compared to the operating budgets from the existing bases. In that amount, it amounts to $9.8 billion in fiscal year 24 and $9.6 billion in fiscal year 25, resulting in an increase of approximately $1.1 billion in the first year and $846 million in the second year. Attachment 2 of the presentation does show all of the increases for current services budget bases that were requested by total means of financing. So it should be known that in the fiscal biennium, the increases are primarily due to general fund requests, especially for the $500 million for the EBRF, and other escalating non-discretionary fixed costs, such as general funds for debt service, health premium payments, federal and general funds for Medicaid, and the restoration of general fund support for programs that were funded using federal money during the pandemic. A department-by-department summary was submitted to the legislature, and I think you all have a copy with you of the budget in brief, so I will not go into specific details for each individual department. The CIP budget was essentially established as a steady state budget with a few exceptions. We did try to address major repair and maintenance in this CIP budget, the completion of latter phase CIP projects, addressing public health and safety concerns, and improvements for energy efficiency and conservation throughout the state. The CIP budget represents $2.1 billion in the first year and $1.4 billion in the second year. Of these amounts requested, general obligation bond funds total $462 million in the first year and $358 million in the second year. And the CIP budget also includes cash CIP general funds totaling $325 million in fiscal year 24 and $295 million in the second year. A detail of which is included on the table on page 9, just noting that there is a typo in the very first number right over there. It shouldn't be 32.49 million. It should be 324.9 million. So I'd like to next talk about the multi-year general fund financial plan. The financial plan is the most recent forecast of general fund revenues and expenditures over the next 6 years. It does not take into account future revenue or expenditure impacts that will be proposed in the coming weeks. So if you look at the general fund financial plan, it really represents two major components. The first one is revenues. And if you look at the revenues, the executive branch tax revenues represent the core of revenues September forecast, which had the rate of growth for general funds for fiscal year 23, the year that we are currently in, at 6.5%, and 4% growth in FY24, and 3.5% growth over the next several years throughout the financial plan to fiscal year 29. In its forecast transmittal letter, the Corps did attribute the 1.5% increase in fiscal year 23 to strong economic and tax collections data so far. The Corps also did note some significant downside risk that could inhibit Hawaii's economic recovery and general fund growth, specifically variance in COVID-19, aggressive monetary policy at the Federal Reserve level to combat inflation, high oil and commodity prices, and geopolitical events, including major economic disruptions that were associated with the ongoing conflict in Europe. Another consideration that the Corps highlighted was that due to the strength of the US dollar in compared to other foreign countries, Hawaii would face stiff competition from other competing destination places such as Europe. The big issue here is that a lot of our economic growth is predicated on a mild recession coming up in the US mainland, but supplanted by an increase in eastbound travelers coming in, specifically from Japan. But as we have seen, and for anybody that has traveled to Japan recently, the exchange rate is extremely favorable for the US, which unfortunately makes it extremely unfavorable for Japanese to come to our state. So these are some things that we are definitely monitoring and watching to see how it's going to impact our projected general fund growth going forward. So another thing, and which, not to usurp the Council on Revenue's meeting tomorrow, is that they will be meeting tomorrow, tomorrow afternoon, and there is an expectation that there will be an adjustment downwards of the current fiscal year 23 growth rate. This is not due to any slowdown in economic activity, but it is due to a accounting change, because what was not considered in the September forecast was the $330 million constitutional rebate from the general fund. So essentially, it was a top-line reduction to revenues, which was not taken into consideration when they forecasted it at 6.4. So we do expect that there will be a reduction in that number, which will change our bottom line financial plan numbers, and we'll find that out tomorrow. So if you look at the overall financial plan, the expenditure portion basically represents the current executive biennium budget forecasted out over the next 6 years. It does not take into account certain major expenses that the state will be incurring or will have to incur over the next couple of years. But what it does represent and what it does show is a continued growth in our current ending balances. So for FY22, total revenues were $10.2 million, and total expenditures were $8.8 billion, resulting in a revenue over expenditure number of about $1.3 billion for the fiscal year. As the way the financial plan is structured, this $1.3 billion ends up adding to the ending balance of the previous year, which basically brought our ending balance for fiscal year FY22 to $2.6 billion. For fiscal year 23, which is the current year that we're at, revenues were $10.4 billion, but expenditures were $11 billion, representing an expenditure over revenue in the amount of $685 million for the year. This is what caused our ending balance to go from the 2.6 to basically the $1.9 billion that we're looking for in the current year. So for fiscal year 24, based upon the budget that was just presented to you, total estimated revenues are about $11.2 billion, and estimated expenditures is 10.3, resulting in a revenue over expenditure number of about $875 million, which would add to our ending balance and take us back up to the $2.8 billion number. As it stands at this point in time, given all of those numbers, our current EBRF balance, which is the portion on the lowest line of the financial plan as attachment 3, it does represent the actual and estimated balance of the EBRF as a percentage of the previous year. But as you can see, with the EBRF in 22, the EBRF balance was $325 million, which roughly represented about 3.6% of 2021 revenues. For 2023, the EBRF balance is now $972 million, which represents about 9.53% of revenues. The fiscal year 23 EBRF balance includes an additional $500 million transfer that was done in the previous year pursuant to Act 115, Session Laws 2022, and a $130 million transfer from the general fund that was pursuant to Section 328L-3 Hawaii Revised Statutes, which is essentially if the state experiences general fund growth in excess of 5% over the course of the 2 previous years, that the state is mandated to make a deposit into the EBRF. So, last couple of things really before we can move to the questions. The debt limit, Section 13 of Article 7 of the Constitution does place a debt limit on GO bonds that may be issued by the state, but it has been determined at this point in time that the total outstanding amount of principal and interest calculated on all bonds will not cause the debt ceiling or the debt limit to be exceeded at each time of any of the proposed bond issuances in the financial plan. And before I conclude, the last thing, we are still currently under this current fiscal year under the Federal Emergency and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund Maintenance of Effort Compliance. As the economy has improved and general fund revenues have rebounded, the ESSER proportional spending of MOE obligation has become quite difficult, due in large part to large general fund appropriations made in both fiscal year 22 and 23 for non-educational purposes. As such, the administration will be coming in to propose moving some of the money in the current fiscal year in order to address those maintenance of effort issues in FY23, noting that FY23 is the last year that we will have to be maintaining the MOE for ESSER funds. So, in summary, the fiscal biennium 23-25 and multi-year general financial plan reflects the state's continued commitment to ensure the state's long-term fiscal stability and sustainability. You'll be hearing from each one of the departments going forward about their respective budgets, and a governor's budget message will be coming in the forthcoming weeks as we continue to kind of compile all of the individual requests from all of the new different directors throughout the state. And so with that, thank you again for allowing me to present this, and I'm happy to answer any questions, and if I can't answer them, I will get back to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Director. Any questions from the members? Representative Moore, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your presentation. I was drinking out of a fire hose, or maybe the hydrant itself.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It was a lot of data. But the budget is 17 billion in fiscal 25, but fiscal 24 is only 18 billion. I mean, it's 18 billion, it goes backward. Usually it goes up. What's the big variable here, or is it the federal money that is?
It's actually the deposit that we are making. The proposal of this administration is to make an additional $500 million deposit into the EBRF in order to turn our hard reserves from about 10% of general fund revenues right now to 15%. And a lot of that is really to kind of establish that structural balance, and also to basically put our state in a position where we really look good in front of the rating agencies. I think as you saw, the interest rates are currently rising. The Treasury, as it stands right now, is the amount of money that's currently in the treasury is actually making about 4%, which is extremely generous because we do have an inverted interest rate curve right now. But that is also predicated on this idea that as government borrowing, I think the last time I was in this role, we were borrowing at about 2%. And I think the last time the state actually went, I think towards the end of last calendar years, the state's borrowing rate did go up to about 5.7%. So that does represent a significant increase in debt service for the state. So
But
that's
why,
one of
why the accounting error of 300 million? You went over it rather quickly. You said it was accounting, or we had to withdraw.
No. When the Corps made their predictions for fiscal year '23 general fund revenues, they did not take into account the $330 million constitutional rebate that happened in this year. So that's why the Corps' current 6.5% projection for FY '23 will likely be reduced to a lower number, not representing a decrease in economic activity. In fact, I think all indications show that our current general fund collection numbers are again, basically on par and continue to be very healthy, but primarily because of this
I
adjustment.
get it. But I said those to ask this question. In the Department of Hawaiian Homes,
Yes.
you got $65 million in 2024, and then in 2025, you got 65 million. Where are the other departments are increasing, but this looks like it's stagnant? Is that because of the 600 million, or?
Well,
what?
they did get the 600 million, but the Department of Hawaiian Homelands is also currently in a legal dispute with regards to what is sufficient operating funds. And until that is really addressed at this point in time, we are continuing to kind of maintain what the projected reasonable, or I forgot the exact terminology, sufficient funding is for the Department of Hawaiian Homelands. That being said, they do have $600 million to work with in the upcoming.
But that being said, this is a multiple decade-long dispute. This is nothing new. But if you're holding back money, waiting for that dispute, it's going to be year upon year upon year for the Hawaiian homes.
Understood. Yes. I'm not a legal expert with regards
I
to
mean,
that.
they're still already decades behind. So the fact that they've got a stagnant budget is rather surprising, given that there's a new emphasis in the Hawaiian Renaissance. To see a stagnant budget doesn't actually say that the administration is pushing as much as it otherwise would suggest.
Well, I think part of it, and this is that the legislature, in its infinite wisdom last year, did give them $600 million. And I think as the new administration comes in, the expectation is, how is that $600 million going to be executed? And we want to make sure that it is executed efficiently and appropriately for all of the beneficiaries.
But it's supposed to be above and beyond the normal, and that doesn't seem to be the case. Anyways, that's just an observation. Thank you very much. Thank you,
Thank
Chair.
you very much. Anybody else? Any questions? Representative Kobayashi.
The current budget that we have in front of us is essentially a bare bones budget from the prior administration. So the real budget comes, I suppose, immediately before and after the State of the State message.
That is correct,
And I would
sir.
expect that we would see a 10-digit increase in that budget message.
We were able to make some adjustments to the what is called the steady state budget, which was a budget that was, thankfully prepared by the previous administration. As my deputy likes to remind me, we have not been in office for more than 30 days yet, so we are still trying to put and compile together all of those requests, Representative.
Okay, but I mean, I would expect that there would be a very, very large increase seen in the new governor's message, whether it's 10 digits or not.
You will see some increases. There were items that were even requested by the previous administration or the executive leadership within the previous administration that were not included, because what they wanted to do was to give the incoming administration the opportunity to basically look at those requests and to see if it aligned within our particular vision. What we have noticed, and again, we have met with every single department right now to basically talk about, their vision, their expectations on the budget going forward, that there are a lot of unmet and unfulfilled needs.
Of course.
I mean, we definitely have workforce issues. We're trying very, very hard to fill all of those vacant positions that exist throughout state government, but it's definitely something that we will continue to try and address going forward.
So, is there any expectation that the budget will have to have, is there any expectation that the rainy day fund increase from the last administration will be the only increase expected for the rainy day fund?
That's currently the proposal that we're requesting as
see.
administration. I mean, if the legislature, through their deliberations, would like to increase it, that we can definitely have that discussion. But the way that we want to look at the financial plan as well as the budget is the establishment of our reserves. The reserves really is the indication of our, what I like to call structural balance.
Well,
Yes.
obviously, the larger the reserves, the better, but I was kind of under the impression that our minimum target for reserves was 10%, which we currently have already met. So
yes.
why would, what additional benefit do we get by increasing our reserves from 10% to 15%?
So the actual administrative directive right now, Representative, would like a combination of hard reserves
Right.
and ending balance to be approximately 20%
Yes.
of general fund revenues.
No, but what is the benefit? Can we expect X% better bond rating for our borrowing, or, what's the benefit? After a certain point, your reserves are so large that it doesn't matter whether it's 15%, 16%,
Yes.
18%, 20%.
I understand where you're coming from, Representative. The reserves in itself, yes, the larger our reserves, the better that we are viewed by rating agencies. But the concern and the look at the financial plan is the growing ending balance. The ending balance is essentially your unrestricted money that exists there. And these are the things that basically everybody looks at in terms of like, well, what are you doing with regards to basic government services, expanding government, all of these different things. So that's really where the establishment of these hard reserves and managing our ending balance is really the focus that this
But,
administration wants to take to.
Again, what's the benefit? Do the bond raters view larger hard reserves as more important or more, how would you say, beneficial to the percentage or to the state's rating than soft reserves?
Simply put, yes. Yes, they do view hard reserves because there are parameters around the utilization of those reserves, and they can't be used for any particular purposes unless statutorily guided. Yes.
So what's the benefit in terms of bond rating?
The benefit in terms of bond rating is, so we are,
One step up, two steps up?
there are two things. We have our rating and we have our outlook.
Yes.
And so right now, we're currently on all of the rating agents that we use, we are on a stable outlook. The challenge that we have, I think, in the coming years, as the national economy starts to, maybe go into a mild recession, and this expectation of a supplanting of Japanese visitors in order to buoy our economy, I think that there is a concern that if that Japanese return does not happen, and I think the philosophy here is that hope is not a business strategy, so we are actually putting action into words for the rating agencies and letting them know that we are taking into consideration all of the different external forces that could impact our government funding.
I mean, my view is that unless there's a substantial benefit to having larger hard reserves, it would be more flexible on our part to have larger soft reserves, which then can be used for expenditure or an economic downturn.
Yeah, I think if you look at the overall financial plan, and we're not asking for any more additional in outcoming years with regards to hard reserves, but you still have an increase, a projected increase in your ending balance. So it is an effort in order to maintain, like I said, that structural balance in the financial plan.
Okay,
Thank you very much. Representative Morcom.
Thank you. I'm just curious, with all the savings that the departments have had with not filling the vacancies, what happens to that excess money?
It either lapses. We do have a process, as you can see in the with regards to budget transparency, in order to clean up a lot of the like unfunded or underfunded positions that exist. But for the most part, the funds, if you don't use it in the year, it'll just lapse back into the general fund.
Do you have an estimated amount of how much that might be?
I think in the past, our history of lapses has, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to look at the person that's been here longer than I have.
For set aside, we just assume about 80 million, but our actual lapses, which compose lapses during the current year and encumbrances of previous years, are more than double that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Representative Garrett.
Thank you, Chair. Morning, Director Salaver. Congratulations on your appointment.
Thank you.
For your willingness
Congratulations
to serve.
to you too as well.
Thank you very much. So my question was regarding the EBRF, and you answered part of it with your exchange with Representative Kobayashi, but it was regarding the best practice in terms of the amount of the reserves. You addressed 20% as kind of the ideal. We're going to be roughly 14%.
Yep.
Has this administration given any consideration to pursuing a tax refund for the residents of the state?
We are exploring and having discussions with regards to reducing the cost of living for every resident in our state. The governor has publicly talked about, certain types of exemptions. But as we continue to deliberate within the administration, implementation as well as executability of those types of requests are going to really kind of have to go through the process. So we will be putting forth certain initiatives that will provide the kind of relief to reduce the cost of living for those individuals that really deserve it and that need it.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Representative Kaholo.
Mahalo, Chair. Mahalo for your presentation. I had a quick question about transit accommodations tax, and maybe from not but what we're looking at the budget for, but in past years, do we know the breakup of TAT and what residents put into TAT and into the budget?
It's a really good question. I don't know if we have the breakout on it. I would defer to the Department of Taxation whether or not there's a if they actually keep track of when they do it, because the way the TAT works, and this is just from my basic understanding from my previous job, it is kind of an aggregate tax that is taxed at the hotel level. So I don't know if there's any categorization on whether or not it's maybe some assumptions could be made, so I can ask them.
Thank you. Clarification just to see what our residential impact. We know that Neighbor Island residents use hotels and the visitor industry more for coming for healthcare services or coming for to see family. It's not always just for visitor stays, right, and vacation between islands. So I'm just curious what that residential impact is to the TAT and what residents are putting into it.
I will ask that question of the Department of Taxation
Thank you so
representative.
much.
Okay, thank you. Representative Ward.
Chair, if I could piggyback that question, it raises the question of, and it's controversial, what's the percentage of the GET tax that tourists are paying? It seems to vary between 25 and 35%.
It is approximately a third of the GE tax that is
Is that
exported
the
to
official
visitors.
department position, or?
That is the most recent estimates that have been provided by the Department of Taxation.
Not a hypothesis, but actual data.
The amount of GE tax that is exported to visitors is approximately a
So
third.
1/3. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. Anybody else, any questions? Okay, thank you very much, Director. We look forward to working with you going forward and getting your actual budget before us and that we can actually start dissecting.
The real one.
Yeah. So with that, we'll, any questions? No? Anybody else? Okay, we're adjourned. Thank you very much.